matched the bomb in Ireland.
So
And
explain, there's a whole generation of our audience that doesn't
yes,
know what
okay.
happened. Where was the plane going from to where?
So
What happened at the baggage carousel? Start from scratch.
yeah, so let me tell you, this starts actually, Barkha, as we all know as Indians, with the Operation Blue Star, and that was one part of history that we
Yeah,
all
but
hope
the
never
flight
happened.
itself, where was the flight going from to where?
People have forgotten one thing, that the Khalistani Commando Force had threatened to attack Air India in October the previous year after Mrs. Gandhi died. They hijacked an Air India aircraft in November of 84. People didn't connect the two. That aircraft was hijacked and it's not even reported widely. It was hijacked from Delhi to Bombay to Maldives to Seychelles, where they surrendered.
Yeah.
Parmar and companies got active after that hijack failed. The entire plan was hatched in Canada, in Vancouver, in Duncan, and Rayat was the bomb maker. Parmar, Bagri, and all the rest of them were players who were arranging finance and stuff like that. Thereafter, the flight left from Bombay, Delhi, Frankfurt, Toronto, Montreal, and while coming back to London, that is when the bomb exploded. Now, the bombs were loaded in Vancouver, as you would know, uh, by some unknown person, M. Singh and L. Singh. There were two bombs loaded on two separate flights, both made in suitcase bombs in a Sanyo tuner. One was going to Tokyo, and one came to onto the Air India 182. Thereafter, the one in Tokyo landed and exploded on the baggage carousel because that flight was slightly delayed. This one blew up in midair. Now you
So
know for
the plan was to blow up two planes.
well, the conjecture is to blow up two Air India planes. Precisely, actually, I wouldn't ground. If you go back to the timings of the 182, it is my theory, and it's not been widely reported, though Terry and a few others agree that our 182 was delayed by about an hour and a half. Had it been on time, it would have landed at Heathrow, which was one of the busiest airports in the world at that time, and this would have blown up at the terminal.
At Heathrow Terminal.
Yes, and on the morning, it would have been crazy. And the other bomb would have burst the moment it was loaded onto an Air India jumbo out of Tokyo. So you would have had two Air India aircraft blowing up on ground, which would have been twice as much or 10 times as much damage. This is what people have not pieced together yet. Two people died in Tokyo on the baggage carousel because it burst just as it came out of the security and loaded onto the carousel. When investigators later on pieced that bomb together, the Japanese investigators, they found the Sanyo tuna, which was similar to pieces that they found in this. That's how they went back and connected it.
They connected
They
the two.
connected the two tickets were bought at the
Yeah.
same travel agent in Vancouver. They connected it was bought by one person. They connected it was M. Singh, L. Singh, and two, unaccompanied bags that went through. So that's how the conspiracy was prepared. Uh,
And what happens after this plane explodes? You have lost your whole life in one go, as have so many others.
yeah,
As a
and
17-year-old, you then begin this long fight for justice. What do you encounter when you start looking for justice?
there were two levels of one was on a personal level. Every family had its own trauma, had its own suffering, and then there were family fights and stuff like that. But that's one side apart.
Yeah,
You come back and you have relatives squabbling with you, property, and I was a young kid then. Remember, I was
yeah.
literally just not even a major, and I was fortunate. I had my parents friends around me who looked after me, and Ivan and Celia, and they were really, really very central to my life and made me stand up on my 2 feet again. But after the sorrow comes the outrage and the anger, and then you want to
Yeah,
find out who did it. As a young 16, 17, 18-year old, you want to avenge,
yeah,
but you realize first, let's find out who did this and how they did it. And that's when you see you start looking at that nobody's investigating it. The joke is when the aircraft went down, and people were talking. It was an Air India aircraft. It was an Indian aircraft. Indian people. There was absolutely, literally no investigation here in our country. There was even less there because there was signs of a huge cover up because nobody wanted to know that the Canadian intelligence knew about this well in advance. Let me
Hmm.
also tell you that the then Prime Minister, Mr. Gandhi, was going to the US on a state visit. They expected the Sikhs to strike him at Madison Square Garden. So the FBI also was in the know. There was the US Secret Service. It's not, all this features in a number of books, and it features in the John Major Commission, which came out 10-15 years in 2008. So it's quite possible that everybody glossed over the fact because they did not want their slip ups to come up.
Hmm.
The Air India victims, the families, got together, and we have an organization out of Canada called AIVFA, Victims Foundation, and the Victims Families Association, kept pressurizing government, consecutive governments in Canada, and through lobbying through. I remember we ourselves went to various prime ministers in India over the years. Went to Congress governments. I remember meeting Mr. Chauhan, Prithviraj Chauhan at that time, to ask them to get this investigated thoroughly. You'd have VIPs coming every year to the memorial in Cork, ministers, prime ministers, president of Ireland, but nobody would investigate and come out with the truth. It took 15 years. There was an inquiry in India by Justice Kirpal, which was just like a coroner's inquiry, nothing major. But there was a inquiry or investigation, so to speak, by Bob Ray in Canada, which was just a sham, a cover up. I remember flying to Canada for the trial, the criminal trial, and I, offered up as a witness. And after days of investigation of testimony, they found them not guilty, and that was like, I remember saying at that
Who did they find not guilty?
uh, Bagri and Parmar, everybody walked. Only Rehat was found guilty on a much
Yeah,
lesser charge. You see,
yeah.
for blowing up 329 people, uh, all the accused got away. They were found not guilty by trial. And I'll tell you this: if that was a plane full of white people, they would have been found guilty and hung. I know Canada doesn't have hanging, but they would have been put behind bars for life. That was the first fact. The second thing is, in any other part of the world, the evidence against these two would have been conclusive to prosecute them and hold them guilty. They weren't. And I felt after years of fighting for a case, our families died again, all over again. We came
Yeah.
back and then we kept lobbying again, and nobody listened to us. I think by some quirk of fate, Stephen Harper came into power in Canada, and I think the families met him and impressed upon him that we need a full-fledged commission. And I think that commission worked for quite a few years. It was under retired Supreme Court Judge Justice John Major, and
Hmm. But
again, I
one of the things you just said was if that was a plane full of white people,
absolutely,
the men who did this would have been hung
yes,
metaphorically. Though Canada
yes,
doesn't have the death penalty, many of them were Canadian citizens, but most of them were Indian Canadians. Is that the
yes.
difference?
Well, the difference was in those days nobody cared about whether you were Indian, Canadian, or anything if you were not Caucasian. Let's be honest. I'm talking about the 80s. I'm not talking
Yeah,
about 2020. I'm talking about the 80s. And maybe a large number of them were immigrants. And I've said this, you know, even in the media 20 years ago, 30 years ago. I remember going on, news channels there saying that it was pure discrimination. The point is, when you had so much of advanced information, how do you allow one plane full or two possibly planefuls of human beings to